By 1996, Microsoft had grown from a small startup into one of the wealthiest corporations in the world, and those who had been there since the earlier days found themselves millionaires. Two of these veteran employees had always loved playing games, and with enough money now to do whatever they wanted, decided to make their very own company. Sadly, neither had any experience whatsoever in entertainment, having only worked on operating systems and functional products. But a mutual friend then introduced them to John Carmack of the legendary id Software, who convinced them that they should license the Quake engine and make a game. The guys were convinced and decided that the time had come to follow their dreams. And so, Gabe Newell and Mike Harrington bandied about a couple of names for their new venture, including Fruitfly Ensemble, Hollowbox, and Rhinoscar, but finally settled on something far simpler: Valve. After the Carmack meeting, Newell and Harrington returned to Seattle and started their company, legally signing it into existence on Newell's wedding day.
So my motivations in starting a games company really grew out of what motivates me professionally. Most of my motivations are social. I really enjoy working with smart people to build products that have impact on a lot of different people. In 1996, when I was thinking about what my options were, I had a lot of freedom and a lot of choices as to what I could do. I could build a boat and sail around the world or go on vacation. And the thing that I really enjoyed was working in a certain kind of environment, which is what we were able to do at Valve.
But where companies like Bungie had started with one guy and worked their way up, Valve wanted to be producing big budget games right away, and it was going to take more than two people, who had never made a game, to do that. And so Valve began to scout for talent. They went against the industry's standard operating procedure and searched for not just professionals, but modders, recognizing that some of them had more talent than working pros. Right off the bat, Valve was breaking new ground. The company was entirely financed by its two founders, allowing the company to take risks that an owned studio could not. However, because the company was just two guys fulfilling a lifelong dream, nobody else had any faith in them. Finding a publisher willing to distribute their products was nearly impossible, especially since Newell and Harrington were claiming their game would feature some incredibly sophisticated technology. Publishers couldn't believe that they would deliver on those promises. They finally lucked out when they met with Sierra Online, a publisher hoping to put out a 3D action game, preferably on the Quake engine. They were impressed by the team and had enough confidence in them to sign them on for a deal, though only a one-game deal, which left them room to back out if the game was a bust. The young company revealed their game at E3 1997, Half-Life. It quickly became the most talked about game of the convention for its advanced technologies and immersive atmosphere. The guys had done it. Valve and Sierra looked to have a hit on their hands. But by the holiday season, when Half-Life was supposed to be released, the team at Valve realized that they didn't have a finished product yet. They were forced to delay the game's release. The problem was that their publisher, Sierra, had already begun their advertising campaign for what was supposed to be their biggest game of the year. When Valve announced that they would be holding off release, it nearly tanked their partnership. Beyond this, once they decided to push the release date, they also decided to take another look at the game. With a year of experience under their belt, the crew had learned to do all kinds of new things that hadn't been put into the current build. And so, the Valve team took the incredibly risky step of scrapping most of the work they'd done in order to start over and implement everything they'd learned. Most fledgling developers would be unable to fund a ground-up rewrite of a game like that, but Newell and Harrington were willing to dip deep into their own pockets to do it.
If you ask your typical Valve fan, Valve's products are always late, right? Of the resource, quality, schedule, stool, we're always willing to relax schedule first to make it higher quality at the expense of everything else. Our view is that a product is late for a little while, but a product will suck forever.
As they revamped their title, Valve continued to push their release from Spring 98 to Summer 98, to Fall 98, to Thanksgiving 98. But then in September, a leaked demo meant only for manufacturers hit the internet and created a sensation. Half-Life became the breakout game of the year before it had even been released. The hype reached a fever pitch, and Half-Life finally hit shelves in November 1998. The reaction was positively stunning. Instead of the traditional method of telling a story through cutscenes, or not telling a story at all, Half-Life never left the perspective of its hero, Gordon Freeman. As such, the story was presented in real time, with the player feeling like they were actually involved in it, as opposed to passively watching it. Making heavy use of scripting, the game also had many interesting moments happening around the player, from coworkers being eaten by monsters to catwalks breaking. In particular, sequences like the opening, with a long conversation followed by an experiment gone wrong, almost plays more like an interactive film than a traditional video game. On top of this were the game's bleeding-edge graphics and animations and a sudden twist halfway through the game.
Rescued at last! Thank God you're here!
All of these combined to make a game, already expected to be a hit, transcend expectations. The Freshman Company, founded by two guys with no entertainment experience whatsoever, made what was to be the biggest game of the year, which would eventually go on to be one of the most legendary video games of all time. To this day, it remains one of the best-selling games in history, all the more impressive considering how much larger the gaming market is now than in 1998. With all the dizzying success, everyone wanted to know when they would see a sequel. But they were to find that the immediate future of Half-Life wouldn't come from Valve, but from the gamers themselves. Tune in next time to watch Half-Life take on a life all its own. When two Microsoft programming veterans decided to invest their newfound wealth into a video game company, most people thought they were just wasting their time. And when they started making huge claims about the technology that would be featured in the game, most publishers refused to believe them. But Sierra took a chance on them and after a year-long delay, finally released the game in 1998. It blew away all expectations, and for years afterwards, Half-Life was the game all others were compared to, and Valve was the studio that other developers wanted to beat. But they were about to discover that Half-Life had a whole second life beyond Valve. The incredible success of Half-Life made several things apparent. First, Valve would survive their gamble and prosper. Second, the world needed more Half-Life.
Mike and I, given our backgrounds in operating systems and productivity software, were pretty sure that we were going to fail. That we had no real reason to think we were going to be successful. In general, from a business perspective, we tend to be more anxious than self-congratulatory. You know, the question is not how has the work we've done previously been received, but what it is that we should do next.
Valve knew that their next project would take some time. So during the interim, developer Gearbox Software was tasked with creating a Half-Life expansion pack, Opposing Force, which was successful enough to let them make a second expansion, Blue Shift. The games took the innovative approach of staying in the exact same time and setting as the first game, but telling the story from a different character's perspective. Opposing Force starred one of the Marines that Gordon Freeman had to fight through, and Blue Shift starred the hapless security guard Barney. Like Half-Life, they were both also titled after scientific principles. Opposing Force is Newton's third law, and Blue Shift is the Doppler effect. But while they sold well enough, these were not to be the offshoot projects that people remembered. The art of modding, when players dug into the game's code and changed it to make new games, was accepted by some studios, like id Software, and rejected by many others. Valve decided to open the floodgates to the modding community, since many of their employees came from there.
One of the things that was characteristic of Half-Life was that it was adopted pretty wholeheartedly by the modding community. Mike and I both have operating systems backgrounds, and when you develop operating systems, you're almost always thinking of the value that you create as being indirect, that you build tools that other people use to create value for consumers. There's not a huge difference between what you do to be a good tool for a Fortune 50 company as opposed to what you do to be a good tool to, two kids in Western Australia who are developing Team Fortress.
With so much of Half-Life's code up for revision, it wasn't long before a boatload of mods hit the internet, a few of which have risen to near equal status with the game they stemmed from. Day of Defeat was a World War II shooter, and Team Fortress was a popular Quake mod ported over to Half-Life at Valve's request. But Half-Life's biggest mod also happens to be the biggest, most popular, and most successful mod in history: Counter-Strike. A team and round-based multiplayer shooter, Counter-Strike was a nearly ground-up rewrite of the original game. The rigid structure of the rounds was a stark contrast to the mad, free-for-all orgy of madness common in multiplayer at the time, including Half-Life's. Its first beta was released in June of 1999, and barely a year later had garnered so many downloads that Valve brought the modding team on board. Valve would go on to acquire the rights to all 3 of these mods, all of which would be given future iterations as commercial products. Developers often don't release their source code because they fear theft or competition, but Valve had proven that an open relationship with the gaming community actually increased sales. After all, to play Day of Defeat or Counter-Strike, you first had to buy Half-Life.
The more you reach out and the more you trust and the more you partner with your communities, the better the entertainment experiences are and the more profitable your business is going to be in the long run.
Unlike most games, which sell a lot of units at release and then tail off, Half-Life kept on selling as gamers kept getting more and more reasons to play. But despite all these other projects, the number one question on everyone's mind was what Valve itself was up to next. As the years passed by with no word whatsoever coming out of Valve, rumors and anticipation started to mount. Not until E3 2003, 5 years after Half-Life was released, an eternity in the gaming world, did Valve finally show their hand. And while outside developers and modders are great, Valve was to show once again that nobody makes Half-Life like they do. Tune in next time to see how great expectations come with great risk. Throughout its long development cycle, Valve's first title, Half-Life, made bold promises that many didn't believe it would live up to. But they were proven wrong when the game was released and sold incredible numbers. Then the game kept selling, because its open approach to the mod community made for some of the most popular spin-offs in gaming history. This meant that a gamer who might not even like Half-Life would buy it anyway in order to play something like Counter-Strike. Valve had made one of the most innovative, influential, and best-selling games ever to hit the market. And they were about to do it again. The reveal of the cleverly titled Half-Life 2 at E3 2003 left a massive impact on the gaming community. After the reputation gained by the first game, everyone was counting down the days to the game's November 2003 release. But during the run-up to the launch, the unthinkable happened. Valve's servers were hacked and the game's source code, maps, and skins were stolen by an anonymous hacker. The hack is considered one of the biggest in gaming history. Enough code had been stolen to allow people to actually play the game through a few levels.
There you are. I wondered what was keeping you. Hope you didn't have any trouble finding me.
This leaked version was buggy and for the most part boring, and was not an impressive display at all. So bad was the fallout that Valve announced that they would be unable to make their 2003 release window.
You know, we've been working on Half-Life 2 for several years at this point, and we're feeling very stressed out from the long hours, from being worried about some of the risks that we were taking from a product design perspective and from a technology perspective. And when we already have people who are pretty much on the edge to find out that everything that they've been working on for the last few years is now spread in a very unfinished form all over the internet, is super painful and demoralizing. It's like the first thing a bunch of people did is they took, the female character and created nude representations of her having sex with one of the scientists, right? So I had people coming into my office saying, is the company going to go out of business now, right? Should we just forget about doing Half-Life 2 and just go do something else now that the product has been ruined by having it launched like that?
Valve immediately contacted the FBI to begin an investigation of who made the hack. But Valve had always held good relations with the gaming community and decided to cash in on all the goodwill they had generated. Gabe Newell publicly confirmed the theft and asked the online community for help in tracking down the hacker. The response was overwhelmingly supportive, and Valve received a flood of tips and insights as to how the leak had spread across the internet. But despite the efforts of both the feds and the community, the identity of the hacker remained a mystery until he himself stepped forward, explained how he did it, and asked Valve for a job. Axel Gembe described in detail the hole in Microsoft Outlook's security that he had abused, claiming that he wasn't really a bad guy and, really, he'd love to work for them. Valve happily agreed, informed the feds, and set a trap for him. Sadly, Gemba sensed the trap and stayed in his native Germany, only to be arrested by German police. As if the whole fiasco hadn't been enough, Valve then got into a contract dispute with their own publishers. PC gaming in Asia tends to revolve less around home computers and more around cyber cafes, thus making these cafes the major breadwinner in that market. Publisher Vivendi stated that they had an exclusive right to sell to cyber cafes, but Valve insisted that they should retain the rights to sell to cyber cafes via digital distribution. The developer thus found itself in the bizarre position of suing the very people they wanted to help them sell their game. This dispute was still ongoing when the game was finally released, though was settled out of court a few months later. After all the delays, Half-Life 2 hit shelves on November 16, 2004, 6 years in the making. With all the bad news leading up to release, a nervous gaming community wondered if it could ever live up to the hype. Fortunately for them, their insanely high expectations were about to be blown away. Tune in next time to see how Valve's innovation in every direction led to monster success on every front. After the smash hit Half-Life, developer Valve benefited from the modding community from its smash hits, such as Counter-Strike. All this success generated incredible buzz for the sequel. So much so that the poor guys became the targets of hacks and the instigators of lawsuits. But after massive delays and a 6-year development cycle, at last it was time to unleash their latest product onto the world. The industry has never been the same since. The cleverly titled Half-Life 2 hit store shelves on November 16, 2004. Coincidentally, this was only a week after another highly anticipated science fiction first-person shooter that began with HAL, Halo 2. And though Halo's sequel was one of the biggest releases of the year, even the Master Chief couldn't steal Gordon Freeman's thunder. After all, Half-Life 2 had broken new ground even before it was released. Its incredible Source graphics engine had already been used to update Counter-Strike, which was available before HL2's release due to the Steam platform. Steam was a major launch for Valve that had several products in one: a rights manager, a virtual store, and later, a community space. It allowed players to buy a game online, download it straight from Valve servers, and then be checked by those servers to make sure the game was legal.
So we saw this as being a big opportunity for game developers. It would change how you would talk to consumers. It would change how your products would evolve. we started looking around with the expectation that this wouldn't be a unique insight, but that other people would be working on systems that would give these capabilities to game developers or other software developers such as ourselves. And the fact that it wasn't there was pretty surprising. And we found a local group of developers who'd started thinking about that. And so we brought those guys in-house, and they became the kernel of the Steam team. I think pretty much all of those guys ended up leaving over the next 12 to 24 months. So it might not have been the smartest way to get that.
Steam even let players download the game's content before the launch date. They couldn't play the game until launch day, but once midnight rolled around, they could start playing immediately. No further download required. It represented one of the gaming industry's first major pushes into the digital distribution sector, in which Valve doesn't have to pay a publisher for their services, and thus retain a higher profit margin. This new distribution method is slowly changing the face of the gaming industry, and Valve remains at the very forefront of that change. The game itself was instantly heralded as a masterpiece.
Oh, and before I forget, I think you dropped this back in Black Mesa.
This is the Freeman. The Combine's reckoning has come.
A moody and atmospheric game that showed its story as much as it told it. Valve created a living, breathing world populated with intelligent AI characters, both violent enemy and scared civilian, that had expressive faces and proper lip syncing, mixed with engaging writing and superb voice talent.
So wake up, Mr. Freeman. Wake up and smell the ashes.
It once again starred mute protagonist Gordon Freeman, this time fighting his way through a world occupied by an oppressive alien race. Aside from the already famous Source graphics engine, Half-Life 2 had the most advanced and accurate physics engine ever put into a game. This allowed HL2 to have a number of physics-based puzzles, which allowed the developer to break up the combat sections for a finely paced experience. It also allowed for the gravity gun, a weapon that could pick up and throw any object in the game, and was entirely too much fun. Valve then surprised gamers by giving them even more content after the game was released. Those who bought Half-Life 2 already got Counter-Strike Source for free, but later were given Half-Life 2 Deathmatch and the tech demo Half-Life 2 Lost Coast out of the goodness of Valve's heart. Lost Coast even featured a developer's commentary feature, an industry first.
We were particularly happy with the vertical cliffside in Half-Life 1 and regretted that we didn't iterate further on that concept in Half-Life 2.
And once again, Half-Life 2 was modder friendly. Steam would eventually go on to host mods as well as official products, many of which show off the power of Half-Life 2's code even years later. But by far the most popular has been Gary's mod. More of a sandbox than an actual game, the mod allows players to play around with the physics and build whatever they can imagine, leading to the kind of community creativity that Valve has always dreamed of promoting. With all of this taken together, the result was a smash success from every angle. Critics loved it, modders adored it, and buyers bought it in droves. Valve had managed the impossible a second time. It would eventually come to the Xbox, Xbox 360, and PS3, thus bringing one of the PC's stalwarts to the console world. Like its predecessor, Half-Life 2 has gone on to be one of the best-selling and most influential games of all time. But Valve didn't want to have to wait 6 years before releasing another game. And so the company once again left the safe, established path behind and set out to change the very way that they made games. Tune in next time to see how Valve went from making games to episodes. After Half-Life went from laughingstock to market leader, Valve Software was under a lot of pressure to deliver a worthy successor. After various delays and fiascos, Half-Life 2 finally released and lived up to its lineage every bit. For most companies, once they have a killer franchise established, they continue to crank out games according to the same formula over and over. But staying safe just wouldn't be Valve's style. Instead of diving straight into production on Half-Life 3, Valve decided to make a few expansions to Half-Life 2. This in itself isn't too far out of the ordinary, but while they were working on it, Valve realized that they had an opportunity here to experiment with the very way that developers develop and consumers consume their gaming experiences. Normally, a studio makes a big budget title that lasts for tens of hours and costs around $50 to $60. These games take quite a while to make, usually 2 to 3 years, or 6 in the case of Half-Life 2. But Valve wondered, what if they took the already developed source engine from Half-Life 2 and only upgraded it marginally, and developed a much shorter running game in a much quicker time frame, and then released it for only $20? The result was a standalone expansion referred to by Valve as an episode, cleverly titled Half-Life 2 Episode 1.
The way in general that we think of pricing is that pricing is another service opportunity. You should sort of give people a bunch of choices so that they can select between them, as opposed to view pricing as a mechanism of extracting the maximum amount of revenue from a subset of customers. Episodic approaches, like we've been using with the Half-Life franchise, are a step towards these more regular, smaller content chunks.
Episode 1 picked up right where Half-Life 2 left off, revealing the aftermath of the original game's cliffhanger ending. Building off the graphics and physics engine of HL2, as well as keeping the game in City 17 again, the development team could quickly go from conception to execution since they didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Released only a year and a half after Half-Life 2 for a measly $20, Episode 1 delivered a taut 6-hour campaign that brought hero Gordon Freeman back to a city devastated by his actions in the last game. The game didn't particularly drive the story forward and featured mostly the same enemies, and as such was more of an epilogue to HL2 than a title that could stand on its own.
The containment system's back in place. It won't last forever, but at least we've bought a little time.
Nevertheless, the game sold well as hordes of Half-Life fans got to play a new adventure so soon after the last one. After Episode 1's commercial success, everyone expected Episode 2. What they got was the Orange Box. The Orange Box was a collection of 5 games for the price of 1, the already released Half-Life 2 and Episode 1, and the new games Episode 2, long-awaited sequel Team Fortress 2, and the puzzle game Portal, all only a year after Episode 1 had been released. It was a move no one saw coming. Valve was gambling that the incredible deal offered by the Orange Box would wind up generating more sales than simply releasing each game individually at full price.
When we have a new IP like Portal that we want to, try out, and we want to, we'd like to be able to experiment with it, the Orange Box gave us a vehicle for doing that. We had Half-Life 2 Episode 2 and Team Fortress 2, which we knew would have strong audiences that would then give Portal a try, and that gave us a way of getting Portal into as many people's hands as possible. Even if Portal was a total failure, it's a puzzle game, for God's sakes. Puzzle games, I think, have sold, 7 copies in the history of the PC industry.
The compilation was a smash hit, with a little something for everybody. It also proved that Valve could produce multi-platform titles, since the box came to Windows and Xbox 360 simultaneously. Sadly, the company found the PS3 too difficult to code for, and so Sony's console did not get the Orange Box until a third party could develop a port for it. Episode 2 takes the player and ever-trusty sidekick Alex outside of City 17, with new locales to explore and new enemies to negotiate with. It is again a 6-hour campaign, though with quite a bit more variety and story than the first episode. Team Fortress 2 decided to go for a heavily stylized, fun approach, making for a cartoony shooter with wildly different class types to choose from. Portal, meanwhile, was one of the most innovative big-budget titles of the decade. a first-person shooter puzzler that completely changes the way you think about space. And though the game is a mere 3 hours long, its mind-bending gameplay, psychology-twisting nemesis, and ending theme song have already made the game a legend in gaming circles.
I'm making a note here, huge success.
With the release of the expected Episode 2 and the unexpected Team Fortress 2 and Portal, everyone wondered what Valve would be bundling with Episode 3. But Valve broke expectations once again, turning their attention away from Half-Life and onto a brand new IP that had been quietly announced almost a year previously. A horror game that would make even headcrabs look downright friendly. Tune in next time to see how Valve turned horror into the ultimate party game. After 10 amazing years of innovation and profit, Valve had become famous for many things, namely Half-Life, 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 and Half-Life. Though they had acquired some outside mods, such as Counter-Strike, and developed a few projects like Portal, these had always been tied back to Half-Life. So as was typical with Valve, they surprised the gaming world again when they announced that their title for 2008 would not involve Half-Life in any way, shape, or form. Rather, instead of Half-Life, their next game would feature Undeath. Left 4 Dead was a zombie shooter, but with several twists to help it stand out from the horde of other undead games. The game heavily focused on teamwork and cooperative play. It always follows a group of 4 survivors, any of which can be controlled by players, with the AI taking over the rest. As with Half-Life, the game creates an intense atmosphere that breaks up the combat segments to give it a more spooky feeling. To this effect, Valve created the Director, a persistent AI that changes the game depending on how the players are doing. For example, if 4 expert players are dominating, the Director will spawn fewer ammo and health packs and more zombies, while zapping out more lights along the way. Or, if one player is doing pretty poorly with his 3 bot companions, the game will lessen the zombie horde and offer up more health packs. As such, the game plays differently every time gamers shoot their way through the 4 campaigns, adding to the replay value. Since the undead has become popular in entertainment culture again, and given Valve's immaculate image, it was no surprise that the game was a huge hit, and Valve promised added goodies to come with DLC. But it just wouldn't be in Valve's nature to do what anyone expected. The company shocked the gaming world when they announced that they were jumping straight into production on the cleverly titled Left 4 Dead 2, which would release almost a year to the day after the original. Such a short turnaround time for a full sequel is nearly unheard of in gaming, and led to concerns that Valve would be rushing the product to shelves.
So after we launched Left 4 Dead 1, and as we were sort of coming to this realization that we wanted to do Left 4 Dead 2 and do it quickly, I think that we became pretty narrowly focused on, isn't this cool? Half-Life 1 was a year late, Half-Life 2 was a year late, Half-Life 2 Episode 3, where is it? So we tend to view ourselves as subject to valid criticism on our ability to manage our schedules. So when we started internally thinking, hey, you know what, we could actually get a really great Left 4 Dead 2 product out in a year, we pretty much assumed that people would go, wow, Valve's sort of getting its act together on the scheduling side, isn't that cool? Instead, for some people, since it was so unusual for us, they didn't sort of see this as an improvement over traditional Valve process. They viewed it as some sort of sign that something was changing at Valve. They were worried that, that we were like, going to milk the franchise, essentially.
Worse, fans of both the original Left 4 Dead and of the Half-Life series felt betrayed. Left 4 Dead gamers feared that this sequel would supplant the release of DLC for the original game and would split the online community between the two products.
I cannot believe you just shot me!
A number of disgruntled fans began a group promising to boycott the sequel. In barely a month, tens of thousands of fans signed up. Meanwhile, those waiting for Half-Life 2 Episode 3 saw their hopes dashed, since Valve seemed more interested in making infected zombies than headcrab zombies. But always conscious of Valve's community, Gabe Newell himself has publicly addressed gamers' concerns, stating that more DLC and patches for the first game are forthcoming.
They're coming!
And indeed, Valve has already released 2 DLC updates, introducing a new multiplayer mode and a new mini-campaign.
The interesting thing about Left 4 Dead 2 is that nobody on the team is like saying, okay, we need to turn around and ship Left 4 Dead 3 in 12 months.
And despite the burgeoning boycott, Left 4 Dead 2 has received more pre-orders than its predecessor. Still, for a company that's always prided itself on being the most gamer-friendly possible, the controversy around Left 4 Dead 2 is probably the biggest setback they've faced since the Half-Life 2 hack.
We didn't anticipate that sort of reaction. We completely understand, in retrospect, why those concerns were there. We should have addressed them as part of the Left 4 Dead 2 launch. Unfortunately, we didn't, and as a result, a bunch of people formed the Left 4 Dead 2 boycott. So our response was, this is a really legitimate set of concerns by these guys, and we need to talk to them and make sure they understand what the thinking was and what the choices that we're making, and get them comfortable that this is, you know, consistent with Valve's traditional philosophy of giving people lots of value, of continuing to support Left 4 Dead 1. And eventually, we actually brought 2 of the leaders of the boycott group out to Valve. The problem is that everybody will tell you that they're not being evil, and we want to give you the opportunity to just sit you down and let you play the game, right? That seemed to be pretty effective at making that community feel like their concerns were being heard and addressed. And I think as a result of that, using Steam, we can see that members of the boycott group who have Left 4 Dead 1 are actually purchasing Left 4 Dead 2 at a higher rate than the global Left 4 Dead 1 group. And that tells me that we did a good job addressing their concerns and educating them as to what our thinking and plans were, so that they're now a lot more comfortable now that we're getting closer to shipping the product than they were when the product was first announced.
If there's one thing Valve has done consistently, it's defy expectations. No matter what it is they do, from developing games to launching digital platforms, Valve has always carefully taken a look at itself and the state of the industry in order to find new ways to push boundaries and change paradigms. As with any industry, most gaming studios keep to the safe road with established genres or franchises, innovating very little to be sure that the title sells. But Valve continually takes risks and gambles that no one else has dared, occasionally finding themselves in trouble, but always pulling through with tremendous sales and a sterling reputation. All from the minds of 2 guys who had never made a game, but always knew exactly what they wanted.
The right man in the wrong place can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah! Did it!
They agree with me that you have limitless potential.